Hello, and welcome back. Can you believe we're already at our final episode? Hi, I'm Chris from Rose City Originals, and I'm here with AccuQuilt in the Dream Studio to help you make your first quilt. In this series, I've been walking you through making your first quilt with your AccuQuilt cutter. If this is your first time joining us, go ahead and watch our previous episodes and then join us back here. Today, we're going to finish our quilt with some binding. As always, be sure to bookmark this video so you can refer back to it later. As a reminder, the pattern we've been using is called Go Fundamentals and is available to download for free from the AccuQuilt website. There will be a link in the description box so you can get yourself a copy. This is an in-depth pattern and includes step-by-step instructions and diagrams for making your quilt from start to finish, including making and attaching your binding. Now before we begin today, let's gather up the tools and supplies we'll be using. So let's pull out our Go Me cutter again, along with a 2.5-inch strip die. We're also going to pull out the large half-square triangle from the cube set, that's shape number 3. And we're going to want both our 6-inch by 24-inch mat as well as our 6-inch by 6-inch mat. I'm going to show you a cool trick for mitering your binding. We'll also need our sewing machine, complete with needle and thread, an iron and an ironing surface. Today we'll be using the June Taylor Quilt Binding Express board. We're also going to use a June Taylor fabric glue stick, and I have a binding spool here just to help keep me organized. So the first thing we need to do is make our binding. And to do that, we'll take an 11-inch by width of fabric cut of our binding fabric. I am using the same fabric as my print, but you can use a contrast if you like as well. And just like we did for our sashing and border, we're going to fold this in half and align that fold with this printed line on the die board. We'll get that centered. Make sure the blades are fully covered, and put on our cutting mat. And again, when we run this through the Go Me, you'll want to make sure that that factory fold goes in first. Give that a little rub, and slide off our mat. And this will give us 4 perfectly cut 2.5-inch strips to make our binding. Now, before we put our cutter away, we're going to use that half-square triangle die to pre-miter our seams. The reason we want to miter our seams as we're joining our binding is that it helps distribute the bulk when attaching your binding. If we joined these strips with a standard seam, we could have parts of our binding that are upwards of 18 layers of fabric to stitch through. The pattern instructions will walk you through marking and stitching your pieces together, but since we're already here and we already have our cutter out, I'm going to show you a trick I learned from Pam Heller. So what we're going to do is unfold each of these binding strips and stack the ends neatly with all of them facing right sides up. Then we're going to line the strips up with the very bottom edge of the triangle shape here. So just along that 2-tone foam. And since nothing happens without fabric and a mat, we're going to shift the mat a little bit. So the lines that we want to cut are this diagonal line and the little dog ear right here. So that's the only part that we want to cover. If we cover this blade, it will cut the end at a 90-degree angle, and we don't want that. So we'll cover just the part we want and run it through the cutter. Give that a little rub and slide off the mat. And then we will neaten up the other end and repeat. The reason that we unfold the strips is that we need the 2 ends to be parallel to each other, and if we leave it folded, they will be going in opposite directions. Another great thing about this trick is that because the dog ears are pre-clipped, you can actually just line these up right sides together, and sew from this point here to this point here. So let's head on over to the sewing machine and sew these together. And now when we open our strip, we have a continuous line. So we'll join all 4 of our strips this way. And if you have trouble with it shifting on you, you can always pop in a couple pins. This seam that you're sewing is on the bias, so it can be a little stretchy and you'll want to watch out for that. So now that all of our strips are joined, we'll head on over to the ironing mat. The first thing we're going to do is go through and press those seams open. We want to press them open again to reduce that bulk. Now we're going to use the June Taylor Quilt Binding Express board to press our binding in half lengthwise. So we're going to want our raw edges together with wrong sides facing together so that the right side or the pretty side is facing out. And we cut a 2.5-inch binding strip, which is this center section here. We will feed that up through the board. And this will help keep everything in place while we are pressing each section. So now we will just press a nice crease into our binding. And then move on to the next section. And we'll just continue down until we have the whole thing pressed. And now that we have this all pressed, I'm going to use a quilt binding spool to wrap it up just to help me stay organized and keep it off the floor. So you just fish this through the center slots and then start winding it around. There we go. And thanks to that quilt binding spool, our binding will stay nice and neat. This binding spool is available on the AccuQuilt website. So now that we have our binding ready to go and our trimmed quilt, let's join them together. I personally like to start my binding along the bottom edge, but you can really start wherever you want on the quilt, as long as it's away from the corner. For the method I'm showing today, we're going to sew the binding to the back of the quilt and then bring it around to the front to finish it. When we start, we are going to leave a tail unsewn of about 10 to 12 inches. Okay, so now we're going to start sewing, leaving that unsewn tail, and we're just going to line up the raw edges. So as we approach our first corner, we're going to stop a 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt. So you can use a small ruler to make a mark, or this foot has a 1/4 inch mark on it, so I will be using that. So we'll just sew. And with our needle down, we will pivot 45 degrees and sew right off the edge of the quilt. So when it comes to mitering corners, you need to give yourself a little leeway so you can fold the fabric around and have enough in the corners. So we aren't going to just start on the next side. What we'll want to do is fold this back at a 45-degree angle. So to do that, we're going to fold the binding back so that the raw edge is now parallel with the next edge of the quilt we'll be sewing. You can see here how the raw edge of the quilt just continues in a straight line with the raw edge of the binding. This will also cause a 45-degree fold in the binding, and that's what we want. Now we're going to take the binding and fold it back on itself, lining up all of the raw edges. And before we start sewing, we're going to check that all of the raw edges are aligned. Right here. And then this fold will be aligned with the raw edge that we just sewed. And once that all looks good, we'll just pop a clip onto here, or you can use a pin just to help keep everything in place while we move back to the sewing machine. Now you can start off the edge of the quilt, or you can go in just a little bit. And I like to backstitch just to make sure it's nice and secure. And then continue down the side with a 1/4 inch seam. Now as we approach the next corner, we're again going to stop a 1/4 inch shy and pivot off like we did before. Okay, now that we've gone all of the way around and we're approaching the spot where we first started sewing, we're going to stop and take a few back stitches. We're going to leave ourselves about 8 to 10 inches there. Next, we're going to join our ends, and this part can be a little tricky for some, so we're going to take it one step at a time, and I'll walk you through how to do it. Now, I do it the same way with all of my quilts, and that repetition has helped me remember so I don't get my ends twisted. So here we have the gap that we haven't sewn yet. And you want to make it big enough that you have space to work, but not too big that you're wrestling with everything. So I recommend about 10 inches. We'll start with the tail where we first started sewing from, and we're going to trim it so that it ends about at the halfway point of that gap. The easiest way to get a good 90-degree cut is to actually fold the fabric back on itself like this. That creates a 90-degree angle. And then you just slide your scissors in and snip. Now don't toss that scrap yet. We're going to use that as our measurement guide. So we'll neatly lay that back down. We're going to make sure all of the raw edges are aligned. And then we'll take that scrap and open it up, and we will lay that so that the raw edge is even with the raw edge that we just cut. If you have a smaller piece, it can be a little confusing which end to line up, but an easy way to know that you have the correct edge is that the fold we pressed earlier will be parallel to the cut of the binding strip. So now we'll take our ending tail and lay it down on top of this. We're going to just gently smooth it out and align those raw edges. You'll want to make sure not to stretch this, but you also don't want to have it too loose or you'll have extra fabric in your binding and it won't stitch down smoothly. And then we want to trim the ending tail along the bottom edge of that scrap. So we will fold it up to create that 90-degree angle. Wonderful. You're doing great. Now we could add those extra binding bits to our scrap pile. Now we're going to take our starting tail and open it up. To make sure we don't twist anything, we're going to take the underside and bring it to the left so that the binding is flat and right side up. And we'll set that off to the right of the quilt. Next, we're going to open up the ending tail. This one, we're going to take the top side and bring it over to the left so that the binding is flat and face down. Now this is where it can get a little tricky to manage. So what I like to do is take the bulk of the quilt, fold it in on itself, and put a clip in it. That will give you a little more binding to work with. Now we're going to lay that ending tail on top of the starting tail so that they are at a 90-degree angle to each other. And we're going to sew from this point here to this point here. That could be kind of tricky to see when you're at the machine, so we'll take a quick moment and use a straight edge just to draw a line that we'll stitch on. And to make sure that nothing moves while I'm at the machine, I'm going to put in a couple pins and I will run them parallel to that line we're going to stitch so they don't get in the way. And now that would take that to the machine and sew right on that line. Now before we do any trimming on the seam allowance, we'll want to check and make sure that nothing is twisted and that we got the correct length. So we'll take these pins out and unclip that bulk, and then we'll just lay this flat. And that looks great. So now we can trim that seam allowance to about 1/4 inch. It is already sewn, so you don't have to be perfect. And then I will just finger press that seam open. And now we'll just finish sewing this last bit with the 1/4 inch seam. Okay, at this point we have all of the binding attached all of the way around. So now we're going to head over to the iron and we're going to start by pressing all of the binding back so that we have a nice crisp seam. And now we'll flip the whole quilt over and we're going to use the June Taylor fabric glue stick to help us stick it down to the front side. So we'll put a little bit of glue on a section. And then we'll flip that over to the front. And we're going to go beyond the stitching line that we can see by about 1/8 inch. And then we will use our hot iron to press that down. Using the iron is going to dry that glue so that we don't have any issues with it gumming up your needle. Now when we get to a corner, we are going to continue just straight off of the edge. And that's going to give you a little 45-degree fold right there on the corner. That's exactly what we want. So when we start on the next side, and turn that over, it's going to give us a perfect little mitered corner. And then we just keep going all the way around the quilt. And now that that's all glue basted down, we can do our final stitching. And I like to pull my thread to the top and then do a couple back stitches just to secure everything in place. And now we're going to sew really close to that folded edge, about 1/8 inch in. So I like to find a good spot on my machine foot to use as a guide. So I will just use the inside of this toe here. Then we just sew along. And when we get to a corner, I'm just going to stitch a little bit beyond, about 1/8 of an inch, and then with the needle down, we'll pivot the whole quilt. So raise that presser foot and turn the whole quilt. Now we just stitch down the next side. And we'll just keep repeating that till we get back to the start. And then when we reach the start, we're going to do a couple back stitches and then trim our thread. And that's it! Congratulations! We can lay our quilt out and admire our handiwork. I hope you enjoyed this series, and now that you have your first completed quilt, be sure to check out all of the other patterns available on the AccuQuilt website. You learned a lot of new skills and quilting terms, and that's just going to help you along in your own personal quilting journey. And remember those cards that came with each of the dies in the cube set? Those are a great way to practice making quilt blocks. And since all of the blocks are the same size, when you have a bunch made, you can put them together and make a fun, scrappy quilt. I used these blocks to make a randomly generated quilt using dice to pick the colors. You can read all about it in the AccuQuilt blog post I wrote, which we'll have linked in the description below. So with that, it's time to say farewell. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you again real soon. Be sure to hit that follow button for more videos, including tips and tricks for getting the most out of your AccuQuilt cutter. Thanks for watching. See you real soon.